Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The Ozarks in 1868, a time when America was healing from its greatest wound, the Civil War. While the nation focused on Reconstruction, a different type of desolation took hold in the remote hillsides and valleys of Missouri and Arkansas. This is the account of events surrounding one Thomas Blackwood, a man whose existence has been largely erased from regional histories. County records from Springfield mention him only 3 times, and the last official document bearing his name was filed in 1872 before vanishing from all records. What remained were whispers, journal entries from travelers, and fragments of testimonies collected by a Missouri state investigator in 1892, all buried until a university researcher stumbled upon them in 1963. The story I'm about to tell you has been pieced together from fragmentary evidence, courthouse records, personal journals, newspaper clippings, and oral histories collected over decades. Many of the original documents were lost to time or deliberately destroyed. What remains presents a disturbing portrait of isolation, obsession, and scientific pursuit unchecked by ethical constraints or outside observation. The trail begins with what locals called the Whispering Woods, a dense stretch of forest near the White River where travelers reported feeling watched, even on the clearest of days. It was here, according to land records obtained from the Howard County Courthouse, that Blackwood established his homestead in 1865. The records describe a purchase of 80 acres of land, primarily forest, with a small clearing paid for entirely in gold coins of uncertain origin. He came from nowhere with pockets full of gold, stated Ephraim Collins, the county clerk, in a statement preserved in the courthouse archives. No one questioned a man's business in those days, especially not one who kept to himself in those hills. Before his arrival in the Ozarks, Blackwood's history remains largely unknown. Some accounts suggest he had medical training, perhaps in Europe, though no records confirm this. Others claimed he had worked as a field surgeon during the Civil War, gaining anatomical knowledge amid the brutal chaos of battlefield medicine. What is known with certainty is that he arrived with unusual resources and knowledge for a frontier settler. His selection of land was deliberate and calculated. Unlike most homesteaders who sought fertile valleys or accessible plateaus, Blackwood chose a remote area characterized by what geologists now call karst topography, limestone formations riddled with caves and underground water systems. The property contained at least 3 known cave entrances and likely many more uncharted passages beneath the surface. Blackwood built his cabin approximately 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, an unusual distance even by frontier standards. According to surveyor notes found in 1945, the property sat at an unusual geographic formation where 3 ravines converged, creating a natural amphitheater of rock that trapped and distorted sounds. The surveyor, James Wilkins, noted, "Sound behaves strangely here. A whisper at the bottom can be heard clearly at the rim, while shouts from above seem to vanish. An unnatural quiet pervades." This acoustic anomaly would later factor significantly in local folklore surrounding the property, with travelers claiming to hear whispers and moans carried unnaturally across distances. Scientific investigation in the 1950s confirmed that the ravine structure created unusual acoustic properties, a natural amplification of certain sound frequencies while dampening others. The cabin Blackwood constructed differed from typical frontier dwellings in several notable ways. Built from local timber and stone, it appeared to be conventional from the exterior. However, fragments of a description from a traveling peddler who visited in early 1866 noted unusual features. The interior walls bore a coating of some waxy substance, rendering them impervious to moisture. The floor sloped subtly toward central drains. Every room contained a wash basin with pumped water, an extraordinary luxury in these hills. The entire structure seemed designed for regular and thorough cleaning. The first unusual incident occurred in February 1866, when a local hunter named Samuel Layton reported finding a series of meticulously arranged animal remains along the path leading to Blackwood's property. According to Layton's account, discovered in personal correspondence to his brother, the bones were cleaned so thoroughly they appeared polished, arranged in spiraling patterns pointing toward his cabin, not scattered by scavengers, but placed with purpose. I turned back immediately. Layton never approached the cabin directly, a decision that may have preserved his life if subsequent accounts are to be believed. A Methodist circuit preacher, Reverend Elijah Thornton, documented in his travel journal an attempted visit to Blackwood's homestead in April 1866. The preacher made it a practice to call on all residents in his territory, regardless of their religious inclinations. His journal, later donated to the Arkansas Historical Society, contained this entry: April 17, 1866. Attempted to call upon the new settler, Mr. Blackwood, having heard he lived in isolation without spiritual counsel. Approached within view of his cabin around midday. Observed the man engaged in some labor behind his dwelling. He was skinning what appeared to be a deer carcass, but with unusual precision and care, collecting the blood in porcelain basins rather than allowing it to spill. His method struck me as oddly clinical. Before I could announce myself, he sensed my presence somehow and turned. Something in his gaze, a coldness, an assessment, compelled me to retreat. For the first time in my ministry, I felt the Lord guiding me away rather than toward a soul. I shall pray for Mr. Blackwood from a distance. Through spring and summer of 1866, Blackwood would occasionally appear at the general store in the nearest settlement, Millerton, now a ghost town submerged beneath Bull Shoals Lake. Store ledgers recovered before the flooding show his purchases: salt, coffee, ammunition, and unusual quantities of lye and preserving alcohol. The storekeeper, Harold Winters, noted in his personal journal that Blackwood speaks little, but listens intently. His eyes never seem to blink. When he leaves, conversations resume as if everyone had been holding their breath. A traveling photographer, Jeremiah Sullivan, passed through Millerton in June 1866, taking portraits of local residents. His business ledger, now in the collection of the Missouri Historical Society, includes an unusual entry. June 23rd, approached by the mountain recluse, Blackwood, not for a portrait, but with an offer to purchase my silver nitrate and other chemicals. Offered double market price. When I inquired about his interest in photography, he stated the chemicals were for preservation work of a different nature. Sold him half my supply as his coin was good, though something in his manner left me unsettled. Summer of 1866 brought rumors of unusual night activities at the Blackwood property. A local shepherd, Marcus Finley, reported in a statement to the county sheriff that he had observed lights moving in strange patterns around the property while tending his flock during a late-night thunderstorm. Not lanterns, but strange blue-white lights that moved too quickly like lightning captured in bottles. And sounds, humming, vibrating sounds that made the sheep panic. We gave the valley a wide berth after that. Winter of 1866 brought the first disappearance connected to the area. A fur trapper named Isaiah Morton failed to return from his winter route. Spring thaw revealed no body, no camp, nothing but his abandoned traps near the border of Blackwood's property. Morton's disappearance prompted little official investigation. Men vanished on the frontier with unfortunate regularity. His case would have remained unremarkable if not for what followed. The sheriff's minimal report noted only that Morton was likely victim to exposure or animal attack, common hazards of the trapping profession. However, a private letter from the sheriff to a colleague in Springfield, discovered in 1961, revealed additional concerns. The abandoned traps show signs of regular checking until February 7th. They are arranged in a precise circle, with none beyond a certain boundary near the Blackwood property. It is as if Morton deliberately avoided that land, despite the promising fur signs in that direction. Morton's brother arrived in spring to claim his effects and reportedly asked about Blackwood. According to tavern accounts, he departed immediately for the mountain cabin, intent on questioning the recluse. No record exists of his return to Millerton, and no further inquiry was made. Another disappearance folded into the dangerous statistics of frontier life. In May 1867, a geologist from St. Louis University, Dr. Edward Hartwell, embarked on a survey of the Ozarks mineral deposits. His last documented location was within 5 miles of Blackwood's property. His field journal, recovered by a search party, ended abruptly with a curious entry. May 20th, encountered a local man today who has offered shelter and claims knowledge of unusual limestone formations on his property. He speaks with remarkable precision about geological processes unexpected in these parts, following his directions tomorrow. No trace of Dr. Hartwell was ever found beyond a single brass button from his waistcoat, discovered on the path to Blackwood's cabin by the search party. The official record listed him as lost, presumed deceased due to accident. The search party reported that Blackwood was not home when they called, though smoke rose from his chimney. Inside, they found nothing unusual, except for an extensive collection of books on anatomy, chemistry, and preservation techniques, unusual reading for a mountain recluse. One member of the search party, Benjamin Crawford, later confided to his wife in a letter that they had found something else, a locked room that the sheriff declined to force open without a warrant or clearer evidence of foul play. Crawford wrote, "The door was solid iron, unlike anything I've seen in a private dwelling. From behind it came a persistent dripping sound and a smell that reminded me of the medical tent during the war, chemical and organic at once. The sheriff decided we had no grounds to break in, though I noticed how quickly he ushered us all outside afterward." Through summer and fall of 1867, travelers along the post road reported hearing unusual sounds carrying across the valleys at night. "Not animal, not quite human," described one mail carrier in a deposition to the county sheriff. "A sound like someone trying to form words without a proper tongue. It stops when you listen for it directly." Local superstitions began to evolve around Blackwood's property. The community warned against venturing near the 3 ravines. Hunters reported game animals avoided the area entirely, creating a noticeable dead zone in otherwise abundant forest. A local folktale began to spread about the collector in the hills, who preserved more than just animal hides. Blackwood's appearances in town grew less frequent but more notable. The proprietor of Millerton's only restaurant recorded in November 1867, "The mountain man dined alone as usual, requested the venison extremely rare, blood still visible, ate methodically, cutting meat into precisely equal pieces, paid with a gold coin, and returned to the hills before dusk." A school teacher passing through the region, Catherine Wellesley, documented an unsettling encounter with Blackwood in the Millerton General Store in late November. Her diary, later discovered among family papers, contained this entry: "The strange mountain man everyone whispers about was examining glassware when I entered the store. Upon seeing me, he paused his shopping to inquire whether I taught anatomy to my students. When I explained my curriculum focused on basic literacy and arithmetic, he seemed disappointed, commenting that the human form is the most fascinating machine, yet we teach people about everything except their own construction." He then asked if I might consider lending him any medical texts I possessed. His manner was perfectly civil, even scholarly, yet I felt a profound relief when he departed. December brought bitter cold and the most disturbing discovery yet. A family traveling to visit relatives took shelter from a snowstorm in an abandoned line shack approximately 2 miles from Blackwood's property. The head of the family, William Grady, documented their experience in a letter to the Springfield newspaper that was never published but remained in the paper's archives. "We had settled for the night when we noticed a strange arrangement hanging from the rafters, what appeared to be animal sinew stretched and dried in patterns resembling letters, though in no alphabet I recognized. The walls, when examined by candlelight, revealed faint diagrams drawn in what looked like ash, human forms with markings at specific points along the limbs and torso. We left immediately despite the storm, as something about the precision of those markings suggested a terrible purpose. The Grady family reported their discovery to a passing lawman, who allegedly investigated but found the shack burned to the ground 3 days later. No official report was filed. What Grady did not include in his newspaper letter, but later told to neighbors according to collected oral histories, was that they found a collection of glass jars beneath the floorboards, each containing what appeared to be preserved animal organs in clear liquid. Most disturbing was a jar containing what looked like a human ear, though Grady convinced himself it must have been from a bear or other large mammal. The winter of 1867-1868 was particularly severe in the Ozarks. Heavy snowfall isolated communities for weeks at a time. It was during this period of enforced isolation that Blackwood apparently accelerated his activities, protected by the natural barrier of winter from outside observation or interference. January 1868 marked a turning point. A severe winter storm isolated the region for nearly 3 weeks. When routes finally cleared, the Millerton General Store owner, Harold Winters, had not been seen for 10 days. His establishment was found undisturbed, a half-written ledger entry still on the counter, dated January 18, 1868. A search of the surroundings revealed unusual tracks leading from behind the store toward the hills. A single set of footprints accompanied by a long, continuous furrow in the snow, as if something heavy had been dragged. Winter's absence was particularly notable, as he had never before abandoned his store, even during previous winters. A respected businessman and community pillar, his disappearance caused significant alarm in the small settlement. Unlike previous missing persons in the region, Winter's case prompted immediate concern and organized response. The county sheriff organized a search party that followed the trail as far as the edge of Blackwood's property, where it mysteriously disappeared at a creek crossing. When they reached Blackwood's cabin, they found him calmly seated before a fire, reading a medical text by candlelight. According to the sheriff's report, Blackwood received us with unusual hospitality, offering coffee and smoked meat. His cabin was meticulously organized, every tool and implement arranged with geometric precision. A heavy lock secured a trapdoor in the floor, which he explained led to a root cellar for food preservation. When questioned about Winters or unusual activities, he spoke with such reasonable calm that suspicions seemed almost discourteous. Without evidence of wrongdoing, we could proceed no further. The search party departed, but one member, a tracker named Joseph Redfeather, returned later that night on his own accord, suspicious of how the trail had vanished. Redfeather never returned to town. His hunting dog came back 3 days later, emaciated and cowering at any human approach. It refused to eat and died shortly thereafter. A witness later reported seeing Redfeather's distinctive hat hanging inside Blackwood's cabin during a subsequent visit, though by then circumstances had changed dramatically, and this detail was lost in the larger investigation that followed. February 1868 brought an unexpected visitor to the region, Dr. Francis Whitcomb, a physician from Baltimore who claimed to be researching folk medicine practices in isolated communities. County records indicate he took lodging in Millerton and asked specifically about the solitary man in the mountains, who reportedly has knowledge of unusual preservation techniques. Whitcomb's credentials appeared impeccable. Letters of introduction from Johns Hopkins Medical School, published papers on frontier medicine, and the confident manner of an established academic. What no one in Millerton could have known was that the real doctor, Francis Whitcomb, had died 3 months earlier in Baltimore. This fact only emerged decades later when historian Walter Berman attempted to trace Whitcomb's academic history and found death records predating his Ozark visit. Who then was the man using Whitcomb's identity? This remains one of the enduring mysteries of the Blackwood case. Some researchers suggest an academic colleague of the real Whitcomb who knew of his planned research trip. Others propose a more disturbing possibility, that Blackwood himself had corresponded with Whitcomb, learned of his death and research interests, and arranged for an accomplice to establish connections in town before his later actions. What happened next comes primarily from Whitcomb's journal, discovered in 1962 during the demolition of an old post office, where it had been apparently mailed but never delivered. The journal documented Whitcomb's fascination with rumors of Blackwood's medical knowledge. February 8, 1868. I have arranged a meeting with the mountain hermit. Locals speak of him with unease, but medical knowledge develops in isolation as often as in our universities. If he has indeed discovered new preservation methods, this journey will be worthwhile. February 10th. I have returned from my initial meeting with Blackwood. The man possesses remarkable knowledge of anatomy, though entirely self-taught through books and what he calls direct observation. His cabin contains specimens of preserved animal organs in jars of his own solution, a modified alcohol compound that maintains tissue elasticity far longer than standard methods. He has invited me to return tomorrow to observe his techniques firsthand. February 11th, remarkable day. Blackwood demonstrated a preservation process involving a sequence of chemical baths that preserved tissue with lifelike flexibility. When I inquired about the origin of his specimens, he became evasive, claiming they were from hunting. Some appeared unusual in structure. I must investigate further. February 12th, disturbing developments. While Blackwood prepared our meal, I examined his workroom more closely. Behind a false wall panel, I discovered a journal containing detailed anatomical drawings of what can only be human subjects, with extensive notes on tissue elasticity, nerve response, and preservation at different stages. The precision suggests these were not theoretical musings, but documented observations. I feigned illness to excuse myself early. February 13th. Snow has blocked the road to town. Must remain another day. Blackwood seems to sense my discomfort. Offered me tea this morning that tasted bitter. I pretended to drink, but disposed of it when possible. He watches constantly. The sounds from the root cellar, which he claimed were settling preserves, now distinctly resemble muffled moaning. The journal ends abruptly after this entry. What happened to Dr. Whitcomb remained unknown until the spring thaw, when a surveying party discovered fragments of his medical bag half buried in a ravine 3 miles from Blackwood's property. No other trace was ever found. A later entry in the town's telegraph log indicates that inquiries about Whitcomb arrived from Baltimore in late March, apparently from colleagues concerned about his extended silence. The reply simply stated that Whitcomb had departed weeks earlier, destination unknown. March 1868 brought increased attention to the area. Harold Winters's brother arrived from Springfield, demanding a more thorough investigation. Local authorities, perhaps sensing the growing suspicion, organized a more formal expedition to Blackwood's property in late March. What they found has been pieced together from fragmented reports and personal accounts later collected by historian Walter Berman in 1958. The expedition consisted of Sheriff Elias Montgomery and 4 deputies. Upon arrival, they found Blackwood's cabin apparently abandoned, though with signs of recent occupation, warm ashes in the fireplace, fresh food in storage. The locked trapdoor mentioned in previous reports was now open, revealing a steep stairway descending into darkness. What they discovered below has been largely redacted from official records. One deputy refused to ever speak of it again, eventually relocating to Kansas. Another turned to heavy drinking and died within a year. Sheriff Montgomery's official report stated only, "Evidence discovered suggesting foul play and disappearances of Winters, Whitcomb, and potentially others. Suspect Blackwood fled prior to our arrival. Pursuit ongoing." A more detailed account comes from Deputy James Harlow, who in 1892 provided testimony to a state investigator before his death. The cellar extended far deeper than possible for a man to have dug alone. Natural cave systems had been expanded, creating a network of chambers. The first contained what he called his workshop: tables with straps, specialized tools, detailed journals. The specimens were arranged with scientific precision, parts preserved at different stages, labeled with dates and observations. Montgomery ordered us to document everything for evidence. In the deepest chamber, we found where he kept them before processing: 3 small cells carved from the rock, 2 empty. In the third, we found what remained of Winters, still breathing, though unrecognizable. The things done to him while keeping him alive, no man should endure. Montgomery performed the only mercy possible. The journals detailed everything. Blackwood believed he was developing techniques to preserve human tissue while maintaining its living properties. He wrote of creating what he called perpetual specimens, human nervous systems kept responsive through chemical means even after separation from the body. His writings became increasingly deranged, speaking of preserving consciousness itself in tissue specimens. We burned everything: the cabin, the workshop, all of it, sealed the cave entrance with dynamite. Montgomery filed a minimal report to protect the families of the victims and the reputation of the county. Some horrors should remain buried. Harlow's testimony, sealed until 1950 by court order, includes details too disturbing for publication even today. What can be shared is his description of Blackwood's methodical record-keeping, hundreds of pages documenting experiments on preserving organic tissue, maintaining neural responsiveness, and what he termed awareness retention. The journals reportedly included detailed observations of how long different parts of the human nervous system remained responsive after separation from the body, and techniques for extending this period from hours to days to eventually weeks. The search for Blackwood continued through spring and summer of 1868, but no trace was ever found. Rumors placed him in numerous locations: seen boarding a train to Chicago, on a steamer bound for Europe, vanishing into the deeper wilderness of the Ozarks. The investigation gradually faded, as authorities perhaps preferred to consider the matter closed. A wanted poster distributed throughout Missouri and Arkansas in April 1868 described Blackwood as approximately 45 years of age, tall, with gaunt build, unusual pale gray eyes, speaks with educated diction. Wanted for questioning in relation to multiple disappearances. Approach with extreme caution. The case might have remained buried entirely if not for a series of similar incidents that occurred in Colorado in 1887-1889, where a reclusive doctor with advanced preservation techniques was linked to several disappearances near Silverton. Though using a different name, witnesses described a man matching Blackwood's distinctive appearance, tall and gaunt with unusually pale eyes and a surgical precision to his movements. Before authorities could investigate fully, he vanished again, leaving behind a workshop that bore striking similarities to the one discovered in the Ozarks. The Colorado incidents began with reports of a new physician in the mining community, Dr. Albert Crane, who arrived in 1887, claiming to have trained in Vienna. Dr. Crane established a small practice specializing in mining injuries, quickly gaining a reputation for saving limbs that other doctors would have amputated. His techniques for preventing infection and preserving damaged tissue exceeded contemporary medical knowledge. As documented in the Silverton Courier in December 1887, Dr. Crane's remarkable preservation methods have saved no fewer than 7 miners from amputation this year alone. When asked about his techniques, the doctor modestly attributes his success to special compounds developed during his European training. The disappearances began in February 1888. First a drifter known only as Scotch William, then a prostitute from a local brothel, followed by a Chinese laundry worker. Authorities initially paid little attention until the disappearance of a prominent assayer, Edward Hollister, prompted serious investigation. When the sheriff's department finally searched Dr. Crane's home and attached laboratory in October 1889, they found it hastily abandoned. According to the official report, the dwelling was conventional but the attached structure contained medical equipment of unusual sophistication. A concealed cellar revealed evidence of experiments far beyond legitimate medical practice. Most disturbing were journals containing detailed anatomical studies, chemical formulations, and observations on tissue preservation that correspond to missing persons in our jurisdiction. The report noted the discovery of glass containers with preserved human tissue, including what appeared to be partial nervous systems maintained in a clear solution. The investigating physician, Dr. Thomas Ridley, noted in his statement, "The preservation technique demonstrates remarkable innovation. The specimens show none of the typical deterioration, instead maintaining lifelike flexibility and responsiveness to electrical stimulation. This suggests knowledge far beyond current medical science." The Silverton sheriff telegraphed other Western jurisdictions about the case, but no connection to the Ozark incidents was made at that time. Dr. Crane vanished completely, though unconfirmed sightings placed him on a westbound train to California. In 1905, records from a medical equipment supplier in San Francisco show large orders of specialized preservation chemicals shipped to a research facility in Northern California operated by a Dr. Thomas Blake. The facility investigating experimental tissue preservation techniques was reported to have burned down in 1907, with its proprietor presumed dead. However, no remains were ever recovered. The Blake Laboratory, located in an isolated area near Bodega Bay, had operated quietly for nearly 2 years. Local residents reported occasional strange sounds at night and unusual odors, but the facility's remote location minimized outside contact. The few who had business dealings with Dr. Blake described him as elderly but vigorous, with unusual pale eyes and meticulous habits. When fire destroyed the laboratory in March 1907, authorities found evidence of extensive experimentation. According to the county sheriff's report, the structure appears to have been specifically designed for anatomical research, with specialized ventilation, drainage systems, and reinforced chambers below ground level. Most contents were destroyed by the intense heat, though fragments of glass containers and unidentifiable preserved materials remained. A junior deputy, Samuel Greaves, provided additional details in a personal letter discovered decades later. What the official report doesn't mention is that we found a sealed room that survived the fire intact. Inside were dozens of journals dating back to the 1860s, documenting experiments too horrible to describe. Most disturbing were the recent entries, suggesting the subject had moved beyond preserving individual specimens to what he called composite constructions. Combinations of preserved tissues from multiple sources, somehow maintained with vital functions. The final verified connection to the Blackwood case emerged in 1934, when an elderly man was briefly detained in New Orleans for attempting to purchase unusual medical supplies without proper credentials. Though released due to lack of evidence of wrongdoing, the investigating officer noted in his report the man's unusual knowledge of preservation techniques and his collection of notebooks containing anatomical studies dating back decades. The officer wrote, "Subject claimed to be over 100 years old, which I dismissed as senility until he showed me preserved tissue samples he claimed were from the 1860s, maintained with remarkable integrity through methods of his own design." The man disappeared before a more thorough investigation could occur. If this was indeed Blackwood, he would have been well over 100 years old, an impossibility unless his preservation techniques extended to self-application, as some of his writings had suggested. More likely, this was either an impostor with knowledge of Blackwood's work, or perhaps a student or apprentice continuing his research. The New Orleans incident contained one particularly unsettling detail. The officer's report mentioned that the elderly man carried with him a small case containing what appeared to be a preserved human hand, seemingly severed decades ago, yet maintained with such perfection that the skin remained supple, and the fingers flexed when manipulated. When questioned about this specimen, the man allegedly replied, my own work from 1868. The subject was a shopkeeper who appreciated beauty but lacked scientific curiosity. The Blackwood case received renewed attention in 1963 when Dr. Margaret Holloway, researching frontier medicine at the University of Arkansas, discovered the sealed records while organizing county archives from the 1860s. Her academic paper, Isolated Development of Preservation Techniques in 19th Century Ozark Communities, drew connections between Blackwood's experiments and similar cases throughout the American West, suggesting a pattern of individuals pursuing preservation research far beyond the ethical and scientific boundaries of their time. Dr. Holloway's research was abruptly discontinued when the university deemed the subject matter unsuitable for academic study. Her collected materials were archived and remained largely untouched until 1968, when a documentary filmmaker attempted to create a historical record of the events. The project was abandoned after unexplained equipment failures and the disappearance of several key documents from the university archives. The filmmaker, Raymond Carter, later wrote in a letter to a colleague, "Something about this case resists documentation. Recording equipment malfunctions near the original sites. Interviews with descendants of witnesses become confused or contradictory. The most compelling documents vanish between archival visits. It's as if the history itself actively resists being captured or preserved." An irony, given Blackwood's obsession with preservation. What makes the Blackwood case particularly disturbing is not merely the grotesque nature of his experiments, but the methodical scientific approach documented in the fragments of his journals that survived. Unlike typical cases of frontier violence or madness, Blackwood's work suggests a terrifying rationality, a mind advancing methodically toward a goal that defied natural law, the preservation of living tissue, perhaps even consciousness, beyond its natural duration. The precision of his work, the systematic documentation, the progressive refinement of techniques over years, these speak to a disturbing lucidity. His final journal entries, partially reconstructed from the fragments recovered by the sheriff's expedition, reveal his ultimate ambition. The traditional boundary between life and death is merely a failure of preservation technique. The nervous system, properly maintained, can sustain awareness indefinitely. My latest subject has remained responsive for 103 days after separation from supporting organs. The eyes still track movement, the facial muscles still contract in response to stimuli. Consciousness persists. I have prepared my own nervous system through gradual introduction of my preservation compounds. When the time comes, I shall be my own final subject, the observer who continues to observe beyond the body's failure. Perpetual consciousness, the ultimate preservation, what Blackwood called his preservation compound, appears to have been a complex mixture of chemicals, some familiar to contemporary medicine, alcohol, formaldehyde, arsenic compounds, and others of his own derivation. Chemical analysis of residue found in containers from his workshop, conducted in 1952 as part of a broader study of historical embalming practices, revealed unusual organic compounds that defied complete identification with the technology of the time. The analysis report noted the preserved tissue samples, despite their age, approximately 84 years, show minimal deterioration. Cellular structures remain intact to a degree that should be impossible. Whatever process was used goes far beyond conventional preservation techniques, suggesting a fundamental intervention in the cellular degradation process itself. The legacy of Thomas Blackwood extends beyond the immediate horror of his actions. His case represents a dark chapter in the history of isolated scientific pursuit, what happens when knowledge advances without ethical constraint, when the human desire to overcome mortality twists into something monstrous. Throughout history, the quest to preserve the human form has driven innovation in numerous fields, from ancient Egyptian mummification to modern cryonics. Blackwood represents an aberrant branch of this pursuit, focused not merely on preserving appearance, but on maintaining function, a goal that crossed fundamental boundaries between life and death. The locations connected to Blackwood have developed their own disturbing histories. The site of his Ozark cabin, despite being burned and the cave entrance collapsed, remained uninhabited for decades. Locals reported unusual phenomena in the vicinity, unexplained cold spots, sounds carrying unnaturally through the ravines, animals avoiding the area entirely. A survey conducted in 1915 for potential farming development noted that the valley containing Blackwood's former property supported unusually sparse vegetation. The surveyor wrote, "Soil samples show no obvious mineral contamination, yet plants wither quickly when transplanted to this area. Local wildlife similarly avoids these few acres, creating a noticeable dead zone in otherwise fertile forest." When Bull Shoals Dam was constructed in the 1950s, portions of the surrounding land were flooded, including the remains of Millerton and potentially parts of Blackwood's property. Construction workers reported finding unusual artifacts during excavation: glass containers with unidentifiable preserved specimens, notebooks with water-damaged pages containing anatomical diagrams, tools of unknown purpose with uncomfortably ergonomic handles. These items disappeared into private collections or government storage, their connection to Blackwood recognized only by those familiar with the case. Some researchers have suggested that the flooding of the area was quietly encouraged by authorities familiar with the history, a final attempt to submerge a history too disturbing to acknowledge. One construction worker, Harold Jenkins, described finding a sealed metal container in a limestone cave that was being dynamited for the dam project. Inside was a glass jar containing what he described as a human eye, perfectly preserved, floating in clear liquid. The eye looked fresh. When light hit it directly, the pupil contracted. I reported it to the site manager, who confiscated it immediately. The next day we were moved to a different section of the project, and no one ever mentioned it again. The last verified reference to Blackwood comes from 1952, 16 years before Dr. Holloway's academic discovery. A patient at a psychiatric hospital in Seattle claimed to have encountered the Preserver, living in isolation in the North Cascades Mountains. The patient, a hiker who had been found wandering disoriented along a forest road, described finding a cabin where an elderly man offered shelter. During his stay, he glimpsed what he described as a workshop where things that should be dead moved in jars of clear liquid. The patient's account was dismissed as delusion until he accurately described preservation techniques consistent with those documented in Blackwood's recovered journals, information not publicly available at that time. When authorities investigated the location described, they found only an abandoned cabin with a stone foundation far older than the wooden structure above it. In the root cellar beneath, they discovered a single glass jar containing what was officially reported as preserved animal tissue of indeterminate origin. The jar was sent to a government laboratory for analysis, and no results were ever made public. The patient, Robert Merrill, provided this statement to his psychiatrist. He told me he was 130 years old, that he had discovered the secret to extending awareness beyond the body's limitations. He showed me his specimens, things preserved so perfectly they seemed alive. But the worst was what he called his masterpiece, a glass tank containing what appeared to be a human nervous system, complete from brain to peripheral nerves, suspended in clear fluid. When he tapped the glass, the tissue pulsed in response. He claimed it had been conscious for decades. Merrill's psychiatric evaluation noted, "Patient shows no previous history of psychosis or delusional thinking. His account remains consistent through repeated tellings with details that suggest actual observation rather than invention. While his interpretation may be influenced by trauma, the core experience appears to reflect genuine encounter with unusual phenomena. The true fate of Thomas Blackwood remains unknown. If the accounts placing him in Colorado in the 1880s, California in the 1900s, and potentially the Pacific Northwest in the 1950s are accurate, he would have lived far beyond a normal human lifespan. Some researchers have suggested that his experiments in tissue preservation might have extended to self-application. that Blackwood found ways to extend his own life through his macabre techniques. More likely, perhaps, is that Blackwood's methods and madness inspired followers, individuals who discovered his journals or encountered him directly and continued his work under various guises across decades. This theory is supported by similar cases documented throughout the American West between 1870 and 1950. Isolated individuals with unusual medical knowledge, disappearances associated with their presence, workshops discovered with preservation equipment, and specimens of uncertain origin. A detailed analysis by forensic historian Dr. Rebecca Lindstrom in 1965 examined photographs, handwriting samples, and descriptions from all the connected cases. Her conclusion: while variations exist in handwriting and appearance across decades, core elements remain consistent beyond what would be expected from independent cases. The methodologies, specific chemical formulations, and philosophical justifications in the recovered documents show continuity suggesting either the same individual or a direct teacher-student lineage. The last official investigation connected to the Blackwood case closed in 1969 when the FBI briefly examined potential connections between historical disappearances in the Ozarks and more recent missing persons cases in Missouri. The investigation concluded without public findings, and all materials were classified and restricted from public access. An agent involved in the investigation, speaking anonymously to a journalist in 1980, stated, "What we found suggested a pattern extending well beyond a single perpetrator's lifespan. Either Blackwood's techniques were adopted by others, or something about his preservation methods achieved results beyond conventional understanding." The case was closed not because we reached conclusions, but because certain aspects exceeded what we were prepared to officially acknowledge. Today, the story of Thomas Blackwood, the solitary mountain man whose preservation experiments defied both natural law and human ethics, survives primarily in folklore, academic footnotes, and the occasional reference in specialized historical journals. The sites of his activities lie mostly submerged beneath lake waters or lost in wilderness, the physical evidence of his work destroyed by time or deliberate action. Yet the case continues to disturb those who encounter it, raising uncomfortable questions about the boundaries between life and death, the potential for consciousness to persist beyond conventional limits, and the darker applications of scientific knowledge pursued in isolation. What endures is perhaps the most disturbing element of all, the fundamental question his case presents, not just what Blackwood did, but what such work implies about the boundaries between life and death, consciousness and its cessation. If his journals are to be believed, he sought not merely to preserve the appearance of life, but its essence, to maintain awareness in tissue separated from its whole, to extend consciousness beyond its natural duration. A neurologist who reviewed fragments of Blackwood's writing in 1965 noted, "His understanding of the nervous system contained both significant errors and disturbing insights beyond the medical knowledge of his era." His central thesis, that consciousness might persist in properly preserved neural tissue even when separated from the body, contradicts our understanding of brain function. Yet his experimental notes describe responses and phenomena that remain difficult to explain otherwise. Whether Blackwood achieved his goals, whether some aspect of his work continues in isolated laboratories or mountain cabins, remains unknowable. Perhaps this uncertainty is a mercy. Some chapters of history resist full illumination. Some knowledge resists complete recovery. In the silence of the flooded valleys and remote mountainsides where Thomas Blackwood once worked, some secrets may remain rightfully submerged. The most disturbing possibility, suggested in the final pages of Dr. Holloway's unfinished research, is that Blackwood himself might endure in some form, not as a living person, but as the result of his own final experiment. His last journal entry, recovered in fragments, read, "Tomorrow I begin the final procedure upon myself. If successful, awareness will continue indefinitely with or without conventional life. I shall observe from beyond the traditional boundary. This final entry was dated March 15, 1868, one day before authorities discovered his abandoned cabin. The journal itself was found on a work table alongside surgical instruments laid out in precise arrangement. A diagram on the adjoining page showed a procedure for preserving the human brain and central nervous system independently of the body, with detailed chemical formulations and precise surgical steps. No confirmed record of Blackwood exists after March 1868, when the authorities discovered his abandoned cabin. What they found in the deepest chamber of his workshop was documented only as evidence of experimental procedures consistent with subject's documented methods, but no sign of subject himself. What exactly this means, what Blackwood might have done to himself before fleeing, what form his final procedure might have taken, remains mercifully unspecified in surviving records. The mystery of his ultimate fate may be the final silence in a case defined by the things left unsaid, the details deliberately obscured by those who encountered them firsthand. In 1968, exactly 100 years after Blackwood's disappearance from the Ozarks, Dr. Holloway's research assistant reported a strange encounter while examining the few artifacts from the case still held in university archives. Among the items was a sealed glass jar containing what appeared to be preserved tissue in a clear solution, labeled only with a date. March 15, 1868, the day before authorities discovered Blackwood's abandoned cabin. The research assistant claimed that while examining the specimen under laboratory conditions, she observed what she described as spontaneous response to stimuli, movement not attributable to environment or preservation fluid. When placed near a light source, the tissue allegedly contracted. When the room darkened, it expanded. Her report was dismissed by university officials as imagination or optical illusion. The specimen was removed from the archive shortly thereafter, its current location unknown. The research assistant, Elizabeth Chen, provided additional details in a private letter to a colleague. What I observed defies conventional explanation. The tissue sample, what appeared to be a section of neural matter, responded to stimuli in patterns suggesting purposeful reaction rather than simple chemical response. When I placed a pen in proximity to the container, the tissue oriented toward it. When I wrote notes, it seemed to pulse in patterns matching my writing rhythm. I know how this sounds, but I am a trained scientist reporting observable phenomena, not a fantasist. Something about Blackwood's preservation method achieved results that transcend our understanding of organic limitations. The specimen disappeared from the university archive the day after Chen filed her report. Records indicate it was transferred to a government research facility, though FOIA requests have failed to confirm its current location or status. The legacy of Thomas Blackwood, his techniques, his ambitions, his potential survival in some preserved form, remains a disturbing footnote in the history of the American frontier. His case represents not just the horrors one individual might inflict, but the darker possibilities of human knowledge pursued without constraint, the fundamental question of whether there are boundaries that should remain uncrossed, secrets that should remain undiscovered. In the waters of Bull Shoals Lake that now cover much of Blackwood's former territory, locals still report unusual phenomena, unexplained cold spots, sounds that carry unnaturally across the water, the occasional discovery of glass jars with unusual contents washing ashore after heavy storms. These are dismissed as folklore, the natural elaboration of local legend. Perhaps this, too, is a mercy. A fisherman in 1978 reported finding a sealed metal canister entangled in his nets from the deepest part of the lake. Inside was a glass container of unusual design, containing what he described as a small piece of tissue that moved when exposed to light. Frightened by the discovery, he returned it to the lake. When interviewed by a local historian researching Ozark legends, he added, "The thing that haunts me still is what happened when I spoke near it. The tissue vibrated in patterns that matched my words as if listening. I dropped it back where I found it and never fished that part of the lake again. Some histories resist complete telling. Some knowledge resists full recovery. And perhaps in the shadowed ravines and submerged valleys of the Ozarks, some awareness continues beyond its natural term, observing, waiting, preserved through techniques too disturbing to contemplate. The file on Thomas Blackwood, the solitary mountain man of the Ozarks, remains officially closed. The full truth of his practices, his discoveries, and his ultimate fate may never be known with certainty. And in that uncertainty lies both frustration and relief, the recognition that some chapters of history are best left partially submerged, like the remains of his workshop beneath the quiet waters of the man-made lake. The sound that still echoes through the valleys, reported by fishermen and hikers in the area even today, a sound described as not quite animal, not entirely human, is attributed to wind through the rock formations, to water against the limestone caves, to the natural acoustics of the landscape. No one ventures to suggest it might be something else, something preserved beyond its time, still calling from across the boundary Blackwood sought to transcend. For those who know the history, who have read the fragments of records and heard the local stories passed through generations, the waters of Bull Shoals Lake cover more than just submerged towns and abandoned homesteads. They cover a history too disturbing to acknowledge, the legacy of a man who believed death was merely a preservation problem to be solved and who may have discovered, in the isolated valleys of the Ozarks, a terrible answer.